Without further ado, let's get up on our feet and put our hands together again for our keynote speaker of the night, all the way from Washington, D.C., Brother Anthony Browder.
Well. Hotep. Before I get started, Mama, may I speak? Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here. My first time to Brooklyn, the first time to the Slave Theater. Hopefully it won't be the last. I'm quite pleased that Brother Maddox referenced those who have been responsible for my development, because surely I cannot take the credit myself. It was back in 1978 that I first heard Dr. Ben speak, and back then I had hair. My hair looked like Don King. My mind was blown. I, 2 years later, first heard Dr. Clark, and again, Brother Clark took me to another level. And then about 2 years after that, I had the pleasure to meet Brother John G. Jackson, who just recently passed. And he took me to another level. And with the guidance of these three strong African men, I have begun to find a true purpose for my life. And until we can find a purpose for living, we're just wasting air. What I want to share with you this evening is a lecture and slide presentation that deals primarily with my latest publication, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Now let me start off by telling you that by training, I'm an artist. I'm a designer by training. I went to Howard University, got a degree in design, advertising design, and so that's my primary interest. It was only after I began to realize, and I went to black schools all my life, graduated from Howard University. It was only, Negro schools, you're right. It was only after I had been introduced to the thoughts of Dr. Ben and John Henry Clark and Brother Jackson and others that I began to realize the extent to which I have been truly miseducated. And I realized then that it was my responsibility to begin to control the information that I took into this body. You all are familiar with Brother Carter G. Woodson and his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Woodson has a saying in that book that I find to be quite personally enlightening for me. Woodson says that every person has two educations, one that is given to him and the other that he gives himself. And of the two, the latter is by far more significant, because everything that is important in a person's life is that which you must seek out for yourself. It constitutes your real and best education. So on the basis of my coming to an understanding, fortunately early enough in my life, my coming to an understanding that I was going to have to assume responsibility for the information that went into this brain, I began to devote my time and my energies traveling first to Kemet with Dr. Ben in 1980, and then going back on several other occasions, having an opportunity to meet with Dr. Clark and sponsoring similar programs such as this in Washington, D.C. So I've had an opportunity to rub shoulders with Sister Shashi McIntyre and Francis Welsing and a host of sisters and brothers who are on the front line, bringing knowledge and information to their people. And as a result of being in this environment, I have truly gotten an education. And so it's my responsibility, as I see it, to do what I can to make this information available to the masses of folk who won't come to the slave theater, who won't watch Listerville Middleton on For the People, who won't buy the books from the brothers and sisters outside. They need the information as well, because they too have been miseducated. So primarily by using my formal training as an artist or designer, one of the things that I have opted to do is to find a way to make the information as visually stimulating as possible, knowing that we are visually oriented people. All right, so find a way to take the graphics and take the design element and take the photographs and to incorporate it into a publication so that our people will want to read the material and then begin to move forward. So it's from that spirit that I have, produced my works, and it is also from that spirit that I will share with you my lecture this evening, which is, again, a lecture and slide presentation, which is essentially a comprehensive overview of African history, 6,000 years of African history. It's important that we understand the significance of symbols. We all talk about the Medu Neter, but we need to understand something about the power of symbols to convey quantum amounts of information in minute particles of time. The Asians have a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, I dare say that you all will probably forget 70% of what I'll say to you this evening, but the images that you're going to see will stay fixed in your mind for eternity. And I dare say that some of you this evening will probably wake up 2, 3 o'clock in the morning once that melatonin starts kicking in. You'll wake up in the morning thinking about some of the images that you've seen, and these images will unlock answers within your mind. So we've got to begin to understand who we are, not who others said we were, but who we are, and we've got to use all of the means available to us to unlock the chains on our minds and resurrect our African consciousness. You have the tools, sisters and brothers. You've got the means at your disposal to free yourself. What you have to do is to cultivate the interest. And I see this forum as an opportunity to bring sisters and brothers such as myself here to give you the tools necessary to pick the lock on your brain and free your mind. That's what this whole process is all about. So when I deal specifically with the subject matter at hand, Nile Valley contributions to civilization, one of the first issues that I had to address is why there was a need to talk about Nile Valley contributions to civilization. When you truly understand the extent to which we have been written out of our own history, and others have taken our historical accomplishments and claimed them as their own creation, and then used that information to empower themselves, and then later enslaved us and told us that we had never created anything of worth, and they desire in practically every way possible to reclaim the spiritual essence of Africa, while they have effectively brainwashed us into rejecting the essence of who we are. We have the keys to the knowledge. And all you have to do, sisters and brothers, is to train your eye to understand that those keys are all around you. You can take one here, you can take one there, and begin to unlock the various doors in your mind and literally free yourself. It's important for us to understand, again, the extent to which lies have been fabricated, primarily by educational institutions, to marginalize our worth as a people. I referenced on the radio show this morning the Encyclopedia Britannica, which, and let me read to you, I want to give you this exact quote, so you can understand the extent of the lies that were fabricated. In the 1884 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, they were talking about the Negro, and they said that the Negro occupies at the same time the lowest position on the evolutionary scale, thus affording the best material for the comparative study of the highest anthropoids and the human species. In other words, if you want to study apes, study niggers, because they're more closely related to niggers than any other people on the planet. Scientific documentation. They also went on to talk about why we don't have the intellectual capacity of other races. And again, a quote. They stated that the cranial sutures close much earlier in the Negro than in other races. To this premature ossification of the skull, preventing our further development of the brain, many pathologists have attributed the inherent mental inferiority of the blacks, an inferiority which is even more marked than their physical differences. What they were saying scientifically was that the cranial sutures of your skull, the three pieces of your skull that come together, begin to fuse together at the onset of puberty, around the age of 13 or 14. And by the time the Negro reaches the age of 19, those cranial sutures have fused shut, thereby preventing the Negro from learning anything else after the age of 19. So if you haven't gotten all there is to get by the age of 19, you out of luck. This lie was used to justify our enslavement. And we have to understand that it is a lie. More importantly, we have to begin to use every means at our disposal to uncover the lies and to enlighten ourselves to assume our rightful place in history. So when we study the Nile Valley is significant because it represents the oldest evidence of the development of culture. By culture, I mean writing, science, philosophy, architecture, mathematics, medicine, engineering, you name it, it was developed in the Nile Valley before there was a Europe. And so what had to happen was to remove the Nile Valley from Africa. Remove Egypt from Africa. And so in the 1940s, they came up with this notion that Egypt is in the Middle East. So whenever somebody tells you this lie, you've got to stop and ask the question, if Egypt is in the Middle East, then where's the Middle West? Where's the Middle North? Where's the Middle South? We've got to begin to understand, sisters and brothers, that we are in a war. We are existing in a state of war. It is unlike many wars that we're used to. They're not bombs bursting in the air, and we don't see the rocket's red glare. The war, the battlefield is right here in our minds. And whoever controls what you think, particularly your perceptions of the past, will be able to determine your quality of life today, and more importantly, the quality of life for the next 3 generations. Why 3 generations? You see, because what you know, you're going to pass on to your children. And your children will pass on to their children. And their children will pass on to their children. So if you have not taken a stand to challenge the lies, and you will continue to perpetuate this miseducation process, which is going to affect the quality of life of your great-grandchildren. This is a serious dilemma that we're confronted with, sisters and brothers. But we're at a crossroads, a very important crossroads in history, where we have the ability now to change things almost instantaneously. Through lectures such as this, through books, through audio tapes and videotapes, there's more information available today about African people than at any point in time within the last 500 years. You can change the world tomorrow. But you must begin here. You must begin here. So let me begin by going into the slides. Let me just jump right into it. And hopefully, as I hope is the tradition, we'll have some time at the end of the presentations for some questions and answers. In terms of just sharing with you the images, I'd like to, Brother can you kill that light? I'd like to begin with this image because it's important. This is an ad that you'll generally find in many publications during the month of February, so-called Black History Month. It was an ad that was published by the now defunct corporation, Eastern Airlines, that states a historical truth. And that truth is, before there was American history, there was Black history. And they accurately portray that Black history as ancient Nile Valley history. The only problem is, the only time you'll find ads such as this is during February. The only place you will find ads such as this is in so-called Black publications. Jet, Essence, Ebony. You'll never see an ad such as this in Time, in Life, in Newsweek. It is as if we are the only ones who are supposed to know this story. And the only time we're supposed to know it is February, which is the shortest month of the year, and the coldest month of the year, which has been set aside to celebrate the history of the oldest people on the planet. It is insane. So we have to begin to understand that every day is an opportunity for us to celebrate our history and our culture. We must see and understand the reality that history is a weapon that can be used in your mental liberation. Next slide, please. Again, when we talk about the Nile Valley, we talk about the development of architecture. The very first building ever designed and constructed by human beings is still standing today in Africa, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, designed by a person that I'm sure all of you all know, Imhotep, the brother responsible for designing this structure. Again, when you see this image, you must allow this image to wash away all of the derogatory stereotypes that we have in our mind, that we have ingrained in our minds about Africa, believing that Africans lived in caves, lived in trees, lived in huts. They designed the first skyscrapers on the planet. This is a remarkable accomplishment. Do you understand the thinking that went into designing this structure? The engineering that went into cutting the stones and placing the stones together. Can you imagine the coordinated effort it took to transport the stones, to manage the crews necessary for constructing this? We're talking about an architectural marvel, sisters and brothers, that we don't see anywhere else in the world. Next slide. It's also important, can you give me some focus on that too? It's also important to identify certain faces with specific points of time in history, particularly now that folk want to claim that Egypt was this multicultural environment. It was after it had been conquered by the foreigners, and that was very late in the history of ancient Kemet. Thousands of years after thank you. We can't have it all, but we do the best we can. It's important for you to see this face and to know that this is Zoser, a king of Kemet, a man who during his reign was one of the most powerful men on earth, commanded the mightiest army on the face of this planet, was one of the wealthiest men on the earth. We can still tell that he is a brother, even though his nose is missing. And that's no accident. We'll talk a little bit about missing noses and lips later on in this presentation. Can we have the next slide, brother? Here we see three structures which represent the most important archaeological site on the planet. It is at Giza where you can find this selection of pyramids, the most significant of which is in the background here. This is Khufu's pyramid, a structure which from the time that it was built, approximately 2500 BCE, up until 109 years ago, this building was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. It covers an area of 13 acres. 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide by 3.5 blocks wide. Rises to a height of 450 feet, as tall as a 45-story building. This one building is comprised of over 2.5 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each. There are 5 stones inside of this building that weigh 70 tons, as much as a railroad locomotive. And the technology does not exist today to move a stone that weighs 70 tons. I want you to understand something about the technological greatness that existed thousands of years ago that cannot be duplicated today. There's enough stone in this great pyramid of Khufu to make 30 Empire State Buildings. Do you understand what you are seeing, sisters and brothers? And you must also understand that this building was not built by slave labor, nor was it built by so-called Jews when they were enslaved in Africa. Because as Doc Van has said on numerous occasions, this structure was built over 1,000 years before the first Jew, Abraham, was born. This is a reality. So again, you have to understand why the Europeans are unwilling to give up Kemet. Because this is a testimonial to the greatness of the minds of African men and women. It is a testimonial to what you can do when you get that little white man out the back of your mind, when you resurrect your African consciousness and recreate your greatness. Next slide, please. Now, you all know what this statue is, don't you? What is it? All right. Now, I hear several different names, and let's deal with that issue right now because it's important for us to realize that most of the names of African people, places, and things have been renamed by non-African people. The word pyramid is not an African word. The word Pharaoh is not an African word. The word Egypt is not an African word. The word Sphinx is not an African word. This is a statue of Her-Maket, Heru on the horizon. It is an image, and there are many scholars who, upon re-examination of this statue, there are now many scholars who believe that this was the oldest sculpture ever carved by human beings. It has been dated to have been built somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. It has the face of Heru, the son of God, and the body of a lion. And one of the things that you must understand when it comes to interpreting African objects is that we must begin to see them through the eyes of African people. Many of the things that African people have created were symbolic, and that in order to truly understand what they represent, you cannot take the image literally. Of course, we know that the lions have human heads. So what possibly could this statue represent? The head on this body of the lion is the head of Heru, the son of God. It represents divine intellect. The lion's body represents the animal nature that exists within all human beings. Think about this reality. We, to this very day, still use very colorful metaphors to describe animal tendencies that human beings sometimes exhibit. Brothers will see a nice sister and they'll call her, look at that nice fox, look at that chick. You know, you invite someone over to your house and they have poor table manners, you'll accuse them of eating like a pig. Sisters all too often, and sometimes rightfully so, will accuse brothers of dogging them, using animal metaphors to describe animal tendencies that we sometimes exhibit. So what is a lion? The lion has been regarded as the king of the beasts, represents the king of this animal nature. But if you look at this statue which is 240 feet long, 66 feet high, you'll see that the body of this lion is sitting down very calmly, very cool, which means that the lower animal nature is now under the control of an educated and refined mind. It is through the development of your intellect that you can conquer the beast that dwells within. That is what this statue represents. And it is because African people understood the essence of who we are and what it takes to elevate our God consciousness that they were able to create 5,000 years ago things that cannot be duplicated today. And that power still exists within you right now. Next slide, please. Here's a close-up of that face. Her-Maket, the face of the statue, 13 feet, 8 inches wide. It is the head of Heru, the son of the resurrected God, Asar. It's also important for us to understand the reality, as I heard someone mention in the audience, that it is no coincidence that this statue is missing its nose and its lips. We know specifically that in July of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte came to Egypt in the first leg of his journey to conquer the world. He came to Egypt because he had always held this ancient civilization in very high regard. So Napoleon assumed that if he could conquer Egypt and rediscover some of the greatness of the ancient Egyptians, this would assist him in his quest to conquer the rest of the world. So then imagine Napoleon's surprise when he comes upon this statue of Her-Maket, the statue which still today sits in a pit below ground level. And it was at that time in 1798 literally buried up to his neck in sand. And the only image that Napoleon saw staring down upon him was this 13-foot, 8-inch wide head of an African, of a brother. And Napoleon was unable to accept the historical reality that he was confronted with. He therefore instructed his soldiers to take the cannons and shoot the nose and the lips off of this statue. Napoleon is also responsible for giving us the statement that history is a lie agreed upon. And I submit to you all this evening, sisters and brothers, that when it comes to telling the history of the story of African people, the general consensus has been to lie, to say that you have no history, you have no culture. But if you are willing to do the homework, then you can pull the covers off of the lies. All right? Next slide. Let me share with you one process. On the right here is a photograph of 1/30th of the beard of Haremachit. This segment, this fragment of the beard, is now on display in the British Museum in London. This is a portion of the original beard. The shattered pieces of the face of Haremachit, the nose and lips, are in the basement of the British Museum, and they're not on display. But this portion of the beard is. Now, I want you to understand that this is the original beard. It was broken into at least two pieces, and you can see here where it's been fused back together. The image on the left is a copy of this beard. The copy is in the Cairo Museum. So the Europeans have the original, and the Egyptians have a copy. Again, I want you to identify the copy because it is seamless. Okay, you don't see this broken segment here. Make a mental note of this slide because I'm going to refer to it a little bit later on. Okay, next slide. Now, this, sisters and brothers, is a sphinx. This is a Greek sphinx. The word sphinx is a word. If you were to go home this evening, pull out your dictionary and look up the word sphinx, you'll find that the word sphinx means the strangler. The word sphinx means to strangle or to hold. The story of the sphinx comes from the Greek, and the story of Oedipus Rex, King Oedipus. The story of Oedipus is the story of this winged monster that had the head and breast of a woman and the body of a lion that was perched on a cliff alongside of the road that led to the city of Thebes in Greece. And this sphinx would ask a question of every person who wandered down that road. And that question was known as the riddle of the sphinx. This riddle was nothing more than a metaphor for the human experience. The riddle was what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening. And the more legs that it walks on, the weaker it becomes. Whoever this sphinx put this riddle to, when they could not answer the riddle, they were strangled by the sphinx. Hence the association of the word sphinx meaning the strangler or to strangle or to hold. Why does the sphinx have the head of a woman? Because the Greeks believed that women were inherently inferior to men. The Greeks believed the women were evil. The Greeks legitimized the concept of homosexuality because they believed that the greatest love that a man could ever have is with another man. And still believe that, yeah. Now, unfortunately, so do some confused brothers believe that as well. But listen, according to the story of the Sphinx, this monster killed everyone, strangled everyone who could not answer the riddle. The only person who successfully answered that riddle was a man by the name of Oedipus, who, realizing that the riddle was a metaphor for the human experience, thought about it and said that the correct answer is man. Man, as a child, in the morning of his life, crawls on 4 legs. As an adult, in the afternoon of his life, stands erect on 2 legs. And in the evening, as an elder, walks with a cane or 3 legs. So after having given the correct answer to the riddle, the Sphinx then commits suicide by jumping off of a cliff. Oedipus then goes into the city of Thebes, where he proceeds to murder his father, marries and has sex with his mama. Now this is the Greek interpretation. And to this very day, those psychiatrists who follow Freud's line of thinking have classified a psychological disorder called the Oedipus complex, and they mistakenly believe that every man wants to have sex with his mama. That's European garbage. That's nonsense. I want you to take note here of another reality. Brother, can you fine-tune this slide again? Here, in this profile of the Sphinx, you see that the tail of this lion does not end with the ball of fur like it does on the statues of Haremachit and Kemet. The tail on this Sphinx ends with a serpent's head. So here we see the first interpretation of women with the serpent and both being evil. This is where the concept comes from. And it's also important to understand that even today in the medical profession, they describe muscles in the body that restrict the flow of something, they call them after this statue. They call them sphincter muscles. The pupil of your eye is a sphincter muscle. When you walk from a darkened room outside into the light, your sphincter muscle or your pupil contracts to limit the amount of light coming into your eye. You all right now are sitting on a sphincter muscle, an anus. And if you could think about it from another context, what the Europeans have successfully done is taken a symbol that represents the Son of God and have reduced it to an asshole. We're talking about serious business. We're talking about understanding the need to begin to reevaluate everything that impacts upon our lives. Everything that impacts upon our lives. Next slide, please. Now, I spoke earlier about Heru. This is his daddy, Asar. Asar, the first individual in the recorded history of humanity, the first crucified Savior, the first resurrected Savior. The story of Asar and his wife, Aset, and their son, Heru, is the first story of a trinity. See, because after Asar was murdered, his spirit came back and impregnated his wife, Aset, who was a virgin. And then 9 months later, she gives birth to their son, Heru, who was born coincidentally on December the 25th, the same date as his daddy. This is a story that was written by African people over 4,000 years before the story of Jesus the Christ. Those of you who travel to Kemet can see these scenes painted on the temple of Luxor. You can see these scenes carved on the Philae temple. You can read the writings. You can see it for yourself. Next slide. That's Asar. This is his wife, Aset, and their son, nursing their son, Heru. We know them all now by their Greek names, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. But it's important to realize that this statue here is the prototype for the Madonna and Child. The prototype. There were thousands of these images which were carved in the Nile Valley. They were later taken throughout the world. It's also important for us to understand that after Kemet was conquered by the foreigners, during their initial stay in Kemet, they worshiped these African gods. It was only later when they began to return home, they realized that they couldn't take African gods back to their European brothers and mothers and fathers, so they Europeanized these African gods. In the next slide, we see the Greek interpretation of this couple. The next slide, please, brother. We see the Greek interpretation of Aset and Heru now as Isis and Horus. After the Romans ran the Greeks out of Egypt, the Romans also worshiped the African gods. And just as their Greek predecessors could not take African gods back home with them, so they Latinized Isis and Horus. In the next slide, we see them portrayed as the Madonna and Child. Next slide, please. So this is the image that we mistakenly accept as the real story of the Madonna and Child, when it is in fact nothing but a pale imitation, literally, nothing but a pale imitation of an African original. Next slide. Now, in terms of understanding the depth of the knowledge which came out of ancient Kemet, we've got to begin to realize that one of the reasons used to justify our enslavement was the fact that we were heathens and had no concept of God. It was the Portuguese who first sanctioned our enslavement. It was the Pope who deemed us as soulless individuals, who stated that it is through our enslavement that we would have an opportunity to know God, and if we are good slaves, maybe we will go to heaven. Well, I want to share with you an image, a scene that can be found in numerous temples and papyri in Kemet. A scene that is referred to as the weighing of the soul. It is one of the first images of the resurrected Savior, Asar, seated on the throne of judgment, making a determination whether or not the soul that comes before him will go to heaven or to hell. All of these steps are carefully identified, and let me walk you through them. Here we see the image of the soul that comes before Asar. We see that this image is dressed in white because for thousands of years before the world was turned upside down, white was the color associated with death. White represented the absence of the life principle. And you all know this. I mean, subconsciously, I'm not telling you all anything new. Think about this next month, on Mother's Day, when you go to church. If your mother is alive, you will wear a red carnation. If she is deceased, you will wear a white carnation. Because we still know, that white is the color associated with death. Nothing racist about it, it just represents the absence of life. Black is the color associated with life. Life comes from blackness. So here we see the soul of this man, dressed in white, standing before two dual images of Ma'at. Ma'at is the counterpart, the wife of Jehudi. Ma'at represents the principles of truth, justice, righteousness, balance, harmony, and reciprocity. We see the symbol associated with Ma'at, the ostrich feather here in her hair. We also see the brother clutching the ostrich feather to his chest. In the next part of the scene, we see Impu and Heru standing before the scale of Ma'at. It is at the scale of Ma'at where on one side of the balance we see the feather. On the other side of the balance we see a symbol which represents the heart of the deceased. Why the heart? Because in the African tradition it was believed that the heart was the seat of the soul. Hence the title of this scene, The Weighing of the Soul of the Deceased. So as the soul of this man is weighed opposite the feather of Ma'at, he recites the 42 admonitions of Ma'at. He declares his innocence to God. He says, I have not stolen. I have not robbed. I have not committed adultery. I have not spoken ill of God. 42 admonitions of Ma'at. And if he is telling the truth, then his heart will be as light as a feather. It's where the concept comes from, meaning that he has lived a righteous life in accordance to the principles of Ma'at. And this event, the weighing of the soul, is recorded in the book of judgment by Jehudi, the husband of Ma'at. And then Asar, seated on his throne, makes the final judgment as to whether or not the soul of this man goes to heaven or hell. Powerful concepts, sisters and brothers, that were developed by African people thousands of years before they resurfaced in the Christian world. Next slide. Again, can we have some fine focus on that slide, please? Here's another image of Ma'at. Now, I want to play the role of a psychiatrist for a second. You know how when you're in therapy, trying to put the pieces of your life together, psychiatrists will sometimes show you images and will ask you what memories those images jar. So I want you to look at this image of Ma'at. See the ostrich feather in the hair, you see the outstretched hands and the wings. Look at that image. What memories does it bring to your mind? What thoughts does it trigger? The ego, Native American. Brother on the back hit on it. Next slide. The concept of the angel came from the image of Ma'at. Here is a 15th century painting of the archangel Michael. Here you see a human figure. Can we fine focus that, brother? Human figure with wings, holding in his hand the scale of Ma'at, the balance of truth and justice and righteousness. On one side of the balance, you see the soul that is to be weighed. On the other side of the balance, you see the forces of evil tugging on the balance for this soul. an African concept. Again, that's why I say it's important for you to understand not only the history, but the symbols associated with that history, so that you will then be armed to go anywhere in the world and resurrect your history by reclaiming and identifying your symbols. They're all over the world, sisters and brothers. Next slide, please. A couple of things I threw in just to talk about the vastness of the knowledge that was developed in the Nile Valley. Here's a photograph of an object that was once on display in the lobby of the Cairo Museum, right in front of the statue of Imhotep. This is not Imhotep, Zoser. This object was originally labeled the bird of Saqqara. It was found in Saqqara, in the region where the Step Pyramid is. This object was originally found the latter part of the 19th century, and it was aptly described a bird. It wasn't until the early 1970s that two aeronautical engineers from the Goddard Space Flight Center right outside of Washington, D.C., saw this object on display, looked at it, and then looked at each other and smiled, and thought it looked similar to planes that they had seen in America, specifically the C-41 aircraft, military aircraft. And so what they did was to receive permission from the Egyptian government to take the measurements of this bird of Saqqara. They came back to the States. They made a scale model of this bird. They put it in the wind tunnel, and they found that it had the capacity to fly. So this bird has now been relabeled the glider of Saqqara. All right? Now look at it. When was the last time you saw a bird with wings on top of his body? When was the last time you saw a bird with a vertical as opposed to a horizontal tail? And what is so fascinating is that they have been unearthing other objects such as this in Saqqara, and is now leading many scholars to possibly question the existence of aerodynamic thought in ancient Kemet thousands of years before the Wright brothers. Okay? Next slide. Here again is another image I wanted to throw in just to give you an extent of the technological greatness, technological accomplishments that were made by African people. This, you all know, is a castle, correct? And unfortunately, because of our miseducation, as we grew up, whenever we saw castles, we would think of jolly old England. We would think of castles in Germany. We would think of castles and, Knights of the Round Table and all of this nonsense. But how many of you all realize that this drawing, this reconstruction, is of a castle that was built in Nubia 1500 BCE, complete with drawbridge, moat, towers, a city within a city. Architectural styles, again, developed by African architects and engineers thousands of years ago that most of us know nothing about. Next slide. Now, one of the reasons why we don't know about this was beautifully written about in a book by Professor George Jim James entitled Stolen Legacy. Professor James talks about how the Greeks first came into Kemet under the leadership of Alexander, the so-called Great Macedonian, who conquered Kemet. And as he went up the Nile, he closed down many of the temples, many of the universities in Kemet, confiscated thousands of books, burnt other books. This information was then brought to the northernmost part of Kemet, or Egypt at that time as it was known, and was deposited into a university that was created after the death of Alexander, the University of Alexandria. It was deposited in the library in his honor. It was then that Greek scholars, would-be mathematicians, would-be physicians, came to Kemet to study the accumulated wisdom of the ancient Africans. It is because of this knowledge that was already available that Hippocrates went on to become the so-called father of medicine, even though he lived over 1,000 years after Imhotep, the first physician in the recorded history of humanity. It's important to understand that Euclid studied mathematics in Africa. And if you understand these historical footnotes, you then will be able to understand how and why it was possible for Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor, to write over 300 books on 40 unrelated topics, which was impossible for one man to do in his lifetime at that point in time without the aid of a computer. But it was a very easy thing to do if the information already exists. And all you have to do is to translate it from Medu into Greece. And then you can pass these creations off as your own. So it's important to understand this book and what it represents. It's also important to understand something about the mindset of a thief. The mindset of a thief today is no different than the mindset of a thief 2,000 years ago. Whenever a thief steals something, they would do their best to cover up their tracks. So the Greeks were no different. If you travel to Kemet with Dr. Ben or Dr. Hilliard or myself, you will see that approximately 75 to 80% of the statues of the African kings and queens and other personalities, 75 to 80% of the statues are missing heads, noses, and lips in an attempt to disassociate African people from that culture and civilization. But the statues that curiously have their heads and noses and lips in place are the statues that look like Europeans, are the statues that were carved during the Greek and the Roman occupation of Kemet, very late in the history of ancient Kemet. Next few slides speak for themselves. Statues missing noses. Next slide. Statues missing heads. All over the land. But it's also important to understand that not all the statues were destroyed. Next slide shows you one statue that wasn't completely destroyed. This is a statue of Ramesses II from his temple at Abu Simbel. Even though that nose is missing and the top part of the lip is a little shattered, you can still tell that brother may look like your Uncle Joe or your neighbor from down the street, still is a brother. But it's important to understand the extent to which Europeans had to recreate the images of the ancient Africans. Next slide shows you an image of the same king that was built during the Roman occupation of Egypt. Y'all thought Michael Jackson was the first person that underwent a drastic nose job? No. Greeks have been doing this for years. And this process continues to this very day. The next slide we see National Geographic, 1966, gave us this image of a Caucasian Ramesses. Now we know that these people were African. So how can this institution dare to portray him as Caucasian? They can do it because we let them get away with the lie. You have to challenge them at every turn. See, because they're not going to stop. They're going to continue to claim everything that is yours, as long as you continue to let them get away with it. The next slide shows you this same process, the Europeanization of Africa. This is from, believe it or not, from Ripley's Believe It or Not. 1983 says here the Pharaoh Ramesses II, who ruled Egypt for some 67 years from about 1292 to 1225 BC, often rode into battle with a trained lion which fiercely attacked his foes. That statement is true, but the portrayal of Ramesses as a Caucasian is a lie. Here you see Ramesses as a Caucasian fighting Africans. Ramesses was an African. He did fight other Africans, but he also fought Asians. There's a very famous battle, the Battle of Kadesh, which is painted on the entrance to the temple at Luxor and the temple of Abu Simbel, that describes his battle in Asia, fighting Asians. So if you don't know your history, sisters and brothers, you all will not be able to exercise the option that Mr. Ripley gives to you when he tells you to believe it or not. You won't know what to believe. Yeah. Next slide. Now, remember the image of the two beards of Haramakhet? And I showed you how to discern the original from the copy. I want to do the same thing with this image of Nefertiti. Now, I ran across this image at a bookstore in London, directly across the street from the British Museum. It is a German publication. This is on the cover of this publication. As we know, the bust of Nefertiti was an unfinished sculpture that was found on the floor of an abandoned artist studio. It was never finished. It was unlabeled. So the German Egyptologists who discovered it didn't have the faintest idea who it was. They just assumed it was Nefertiti. Assumed that it was Nefertiti. So this image was doctored up, and I want to show you how to identify the fact that this is the original image of Nefertiti. You see here a crack that runs down the entire crown, runs past the ear, which explains why the ear is damaged. It also extends down beneath her neck, which means that this statue was originally broken into at least 3 different pieces. You see here a gash above her eyebrow. You see here a hole in her ear where an earring once was. This is the original bust of Nefertiti. Now, sisters and brothers, what the Germans did is the same thing that the French have done, the same thing that the English have done. Whenever they find something that's a little bit too black, they'll take it in the back room and they'll doctor it up. Copy. But also what they did in making this copy was to lighten the skin and then make the nose and the lips smaller than the original. So we have to understand what has been happening to our history, to our culture, and to our images over thousands of years. Next slide. Now, I want to take you back to this temple of Ramesses II in Luxor, and I want to focus your attention specifically on this object here. This is called a tekken. Many of us know it by its Greek name, an obelisk. This is a symbol that was created in Kemet, a symbol that was designed to represent the resurrection of Asar. Remember I told you earlier, and you all should be familiar with the story, Asar was murdered and was later resurrected. And so this symbol here, the tekken, came to represent the resurrection of Asar. There were at one time over 1,200 of these structures throughout all of Kemet. Wherever you saw there was at one time 2 of these structures flanking the entrance to this particular temple. Almost every temple had 2 tekkenu. Wherever you see 2 tekkenu standing in tandem with one another, they represent the masculine and feminine complementary aspects of the Creator. All right? But it's important for us to understand that in 1833, after Egypt was then ruled by the Arabs, Muhammad Ali, the Turkish ruler, Muhammad Ali, who was then the ruler of Egypt, who didn't have any affinity with the culture of the ancient Kemites, saw nothing wrong with giving this other tekken to his good friend, King Louis Philippe of France. Gave it to him as a gift in exchange for a clock, which Muhammad Ali put in his mosque. And the next slide shows you this clock that was given to him by King Louis Philippe, a clock that never worked, all right, stands at the citadel at the mosque of Muhammad Ali in Cairo. And King Louis Philippe's gift, the next slide, now stands majestically at the Place de la Concorde in Paris, France. Now understand what this structure is. It is a symbol. It has a variety of meanings, but I want to focus on just one interpretation tonight. It is a symbol which represents the resurrection of Asar, the first story of a resurrected Savior. It is a symbol of an African God. Today, there are probably less than a dozen of these structures in Kemet. The rest have been scattered all over the world. Next slide shows you, yeah, there's one right here in Central Park. That's right. It's growing. And there's a wonderful story. As a matter of fact, the next volume of this series, Exploding the Myths, is going to deal specifically with the European theft of African monuments. It's tentatively called An African-Centered View of Washington, D.C., Masonry in the United States, in which we're going to talk about the European lust for African monuments, their attempt to recreate the essence, the spirit of ancient Kemet in the United States of America. Here is an African tekken that stands in the center of St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. Every Easter Sunday, the next slide, Every Easter Sunday, as the Pope stands, okay, I don't have it. Every Easter Sunday, as the Pope stands on his balcony delivering his Easter sermon, he stands before a 6,000-year-old monument that represents the resurrection of an African god. The Pope knows that. That's why the Pope prays to images of Set and Heru, the African Madonna and Child. Every time the Pope goes to his homeland in Czeskowa, Poland, he prays at the shrine of the Black Madonna and Child. He knows what the real deal is. African Tekenu in England. Next slide. Everywhere you go, you find African symbols. Here is a symbol. This is in Charlestown, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. A memorial built to honor the European Americans who died fighting in the Revolutionary War. Now think about this reality. They are fighting the British for the control of the land that they took from the Native Americans. And in honoring their dead, they do not use a British monument or a French monument or a Greek monument. They use an African monument. Why? Because of the secret reverence they have for those things that sprang from the minds of African people. This is an important reality that we have to understand. Next slide, please. Here, all right, my hometown, my current hometown is in Washington, D.C. We have a tour, an African-centered tour of Washington that I created back in 1986. And it was a tour that I did. I had just come back from my second trip to Kemet. And I kept, the trip was fresh on my mind. And as I drove around the city of Washington, I kept getting flashbacks to things that I had seen in Kemet. And then, it suddenly dawned upon me that there were a host of objects in Washington, D.C. that were similar to things that I had seen in Kemet. So what I did was to identify a number of these objects and to develop a tour that dealt specifically with the design of Washington, D.C. based upon African concepts of city planning, African concepts of monumental architecture. And so what I want to show you in these next few series of slides is the extent to which those responsible for creating the capital of the United States of America borrowed from your ancestors. Here is, wait, go back, brother, go back. Don't jump in now. This is the Washington Monument, the tallest Tekken in the world. Again, realize that this is a symbol that represents the resurrection of an African god. This symbol is now the symbol for the most powerful nation on the face of this planet. Here you see the reflection of the monument in its reflection pool. And all you have to do is to study the architectural styles developed by our African ancestors to realize that this is nothing but a pale imitation of an African original. The next slide shows you the Apeti Sut or Karnak Temple in Kemet, two standing Tekenu and their reflection in their reflection pool. Every temple in Kemet had Tekenu. Every temple in Kemet had a sacred lake. So you can begin to see where these ideas came from and how they influence your European masters. Next slide. Here's a photograph that I ran across a couple of years ago. This, in 1912, a committee was established to build a memorial to Abraham Lincoln, okay? And John Russell Pope, one of the most famous architects of Washington, D.C., designed a number of really famous structures, submitted this drawing as a memorial for Abraham Lincoln. This is a drawing of a scale model of Khufu's pyramid as a memorial for Abraham Lincoln. Now, the members on that committee rejected this drawing because it was, quote unquote, unoriginal and would have been a little bit too obvious as to what their inspiration was. So they rejected his design, and they opted for the more traditional Greco-Roman style architectural structure, which you see in the next slide here. All right? They opted for this structure here. But what's interesting to note is that the artist, the sculptor that they hired to create the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the memorial borrowed from an image that can be found in the Nile Valley. The next slide shows you Abraham Lincoln sitting on his throne in the Lincoln Memorial. That was inspired by the next slide, Ramesses II seated on his throne in Abu Simbel. Again, if you understand the symbols, if you know how to interpret the symbols, you can find your history anywhere. You can walk down the street, any city in the United States, and see your historical greatness. Next slide. Memphis, Tennessee, 2 years ago, built this scale model of Khufu's pyramid, a 33-story pyramid. They're even talking about, or should I say, there was talk at one point in time about putting Elvis's body in this pyramid at what would be the equivalent of the king's chamber. But it's significant for us to understand something about the history of Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was founded by Andrew Jackson along with two other individuals. He designated that site in Tennessee alongside the Mississippi River because the Mississippi reminded him of the Nile River in Egypt. You all are aware of the fact that the city of Memphis is a Greek interpretation of an African name. The African name is the city of Men-Nefer. It was renamed Memphis. It was the capital of Kemet. It is where the king of Kemet lived in his palace, his royal palace, which was called the Double White House. Okay? So Andrew Jackson built Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, to this very day, has a sister city relationship with Memphis and Kemet. If you were to go up the Mississippi River to my home state of Illinois, you'll find at the tip of Illinois an African city named Cairo, Illinois. They got that southern twang. It should be Cairo, but they call it Cairo, Illinois. The whole southern region of Illinois is referred to as Little Egypt because the people who settled there saw a similarity between the Delta region of southern Illinois and the Delta region of Lower Kemet. In this region of Little Egypt, you'll find the city of Thebes, the city of Luxor, you'll find Lake Ramesses, you'll find Lake Egypt, a host of cities that were renamed after Egyptian cities. Next slide. San Francisco, California, you'll find pyramids. Again, I want you to understand how we have inspired people throughout the world and what these structures actually represent. The next slide, please. One of the pages in my book deals with this whole concept of architecture, in which I trace the origins of the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, the Etruscan, and the Composite columns of Greco-Roman architecture are nothing but variations of a theme that were developed in the Nile Valley 2,000 years before the birth of Greece. All of these styles can be traced back to our African ancestors. You see these styles, the Ionic, specifically the Ionic and the Corinthian columns adorn most of the buildings in New York, in the world. This is an African-inspired style. Next slide, please. Here's a photograph of Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius, individual who is also referred to as the world's first Christ. Understand the meaning of that word. The word Christ means the anointed one who is endowed with certain talents and abilities. First physician, the first architect, philosopher, prime minister to the king Zoser, a man worthy of his title. Next slide, please. These are symbols that came from the Nile Valley. The caduceus is a symbol that can be found in ancient Kemet, a symbol associated with Imhotep, the original father of medicine, a symbol associated with Jehudi, who is the Netcher of medicine. Jehudi represents the process of divine articulation of speech. He was a Netcher of science and writing and medicine. So this symbol that we call the caduceus, the symbol of medicine today, was derived from the Nile Valley and has been modified and used by the National Medical Association. The American Medical Association is the symbol associated with veterinary medicine, all right? Associated with dentistry. The RX symbol for pharmacy. The RX symbol for pharmacy. was introduced to Europeans by the Roman physician Galen in the 2nd century, who used to write prescriptions for his patients in miseducation. All right, so the RX symbol comes from the Achit eye, or the eye of Jehudi, the eye of the nature associated with medicine. The symbols are everywhere. Next slide. The gods, even the gods of Greece and Rome, can be traced back to their African counterparts. And what I did here is to show you just one example. Here we see the Roman god Mercury, who was copied from the Greek god Hermes, who was copied from the African god Jehudi. Here you see Jehudi, the nature of science and medicine, holding in his hands 2 staffs with serpents intertwined around them, one wearing the crown of Upper Kemet, the other wearing the crown of Lower Kemet. You see the same symbol has been modified. It is now being held by Hermes. It is called the caduceus, and you also see Mercury holding this same symbol. Again, if you understand the history and the symbolism, you can reclaim your heritage. Next slide. Again, another image out of the book, something as simple as the alphabet. You can trace back every letter of the Roman alphabet, which we use today, can be traced back to its Greek counterpart, which can be traced back to its Phoenician counterpart, which can be traced back to its Semitic counterpart, which can be traced all the way back to a Kemetic prototype. Every instance, they're the same. Even the meanings of these symbols are the same. Next slide. Now, the artist in me, looks for examples everywhere, all right? Here is the eye of Heru, the son of God. The right eye of Heru, the eye of the falcon. The eye of the falcon is important because the falcon flies above the earth, has keen vision. Falcons are birds of prey which have over 1 billion vision cells in their eyes, in contrast to humans that have approximately 1.5 million vision cells. So falcons represent, like God, the ability to see everywhere instantaneously, keen insight. And so the eye of Heru was modified and used as the symbol for the logo for CBS. I just discovered this past summer that it was a brother at CBS who designed this logo and later quit after they refused to pay him for his creation. This symbol represents the lens of the camera, which, like the eye of Heru, the eye of God, has the ability to see everywhere instantaneously and to transmit that information in a matter of seconds. The same concept was incorporated into the logo for HBO. Hollywood Pictures uses a modified version of Hayamaket and the sun for its logo. And there are many corporate entities in America and throughout the world that have embraced elements of African symbolism, of Nile Valley symbolism, and they will never give you credit for that. Next slide. Now let me just share with you another mind blower, all right? Another mind blower. And I can't take the credit for this. I was in Houston, Texas last April, and after my lecture, a brother came up to me and dropped this on me. He said, "Man, have you seen the image of Ptah?" The image of Ptah is exactly the same as the image of the Oscar. The Oscar is the highest award that is given by the National Academy of Artists and Craftsmen. All right? Ptah was the patron god of Menepher, the city of Memphis. He was the patron god of artists and craftsmen. All right? They didn't even bother to change the concept. They didn't even change the pose. Our images, our culture is everywhere. That's why they don't want you all reading this stuff. That's why they don't want you all coming to these lectures. That's why they don't want you all teaching this stuff in the classroom. Next slide, please. Here. The front of the Great Seal of the United States. Again, another important reality is that when this country was founded, 1776, When the quote-unquote official birth date of this country, 1776, they established a committee to design a great seal that was to represent the heart and the soul of this nation. There were 3 committees that met over a 6-year period from 1776 to 1802. No, yeah, 1782, all right? 3 committees that met to determine everything that is incorporated into this seal that you see before you. So I want you to understand from an artist's perspective, I want you to understand that everything that you see on this seal has a meaning. It is there for a specific purpose. You all may not understand the purpose, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some significance for the people who created it. So if you look at this symbol, you'll see that the reverse of the great seal has an eye, which is the eye of Heru, the eye of God. You see here a pyramid. Now let me ask you a question. Where are pyramids? Any pyramids in France, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, Switzerland, Nova Scotia? The only place you'll find pyramids is in Africa. There's approximately 72 pyramids in Egypt, about 15 pyramids in the Sudan, and about a dozen pyramids in Ethiopia. The only other place outside of the continent of Africa where you'll find pyramids is in Mexico. And those of you who are familiar with the writings of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima know that Africans from the Nile Valley navigated the Atlantic Ocean somewhere between 600 and 400 BCE, 900 and 600 BCE, and brought with them knowledge of pyramid building, stone construction, math, and science. Wherever African people have traveled in the world, they've left their mark. They have built civilizations. They've not destroyed them as others have. So understand what this symbol means. It is a symbol of greatness. So when those responsible for creating this nation chose to pattern themselves after great nations in the past, they had to look to Kemet. It's also important that you understand how to interpret this symbol. Let me just take a moment to run this past you, because if you were to tour the Department of State where this symbol is displayed, the guide there will tell you that the pyramid here is comprised of 13 courses of stone, which represent the 13 colonies which form one nation in the year 1776, which is inscribed in Roman numerals at the base. The inscription Novus Ordo Seclorum means that this was a new order of ages that was created in the year 1776. The eye above the pyramid represents the divine eye of providence. The inscription Anua Coeptis means that God is pleased with the creation of this new nation. Now that is the official Department of State interpretation of this symbol. But now, if you understand that this is an African symbol, if you know how to interpret the symbol, and if you also correctly interpret the Latin, you will get a deeper meaning of the symbol. Novus Ordo Seclorum, the word novus means new, the word ordo means order, the word seclorum means secluded or hidden. So it represents the new secret or hidden order, which was founded in the year 1776, that was based on knowledge and information which came from Africa. The eye above the pyramid and the inscription Anua Coeptis. The word Anuit means annual. The word Coeptis means unlimited wealth. So the unlimited wealth that this nation received was not due to the blessings of God, but to the fact that they kidnapped the descendants of the people responsible for creating this structure and used them as a free labor source for over 400 years. If you ain't got to pay somebody for 400 years, you will become wealthy. That is what this symbol represents. The front of the Great Seal. Brother, can you focus that again? The front of the Great Seal is a symbol of the eagle, the symbol for the United States of America. And again, this symbol is symbolic. Every component in this symbol means something. It means one thing to you, it means something else to the people who designed it. If you study this symbol, you'll see that the eagle has on its chest a shield with 13 stripes. It has in one claw an olive branch which has on it 13 leaves and 13 berries. It has in the other claw arrows. It has in its mouth a banner with the words E pluribus unum, which is comprised of 13 letters. It has above its head a cluster of 13 stars. In total, the number 13 is repeated 13 times on the dollar bill. So a question that you have to begin to ask yourself is, what is the significance of that? Particularly if you've grown up in an environment that tells you 13 is an unlucky number. Friday the 13th is an unlucky day. Most theaters don't have a 13th row. Most buildings don't have a 13th floor. So if 13 is an unlucky number, why is the history of this country linked to the number 13? If you study something about the people responsible for developing this country, they were Masons. And Masonry represents nothing more but an attempt to recreate the educational system of ancient Kemet. You'll begin to understand that they had a different interpretation of numbers. Numbers are a language unto themselves. Every number represents profound concepts and ideas. For example, the number 1 has always been associated with God, the Creator. The number 2 represents man and woman who comes from God. Number 3 represents the union of man and woman, which creates a child, the Trinity. Every number represents something profoundly significant. The number 12 represents the completion of a cycle, as in 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night during the time of the equinox represent a complete day. 12 months represent a complete year. The number 13, therefore, represents the process of spiritual transformation. That is, the number 12 represents the completion of a cycle. The number 13 represents the energy from that completed cycle moving into a higher spiritual state. That is why this country was founded with 13 colonies. That is why the slogan that was used during the Revolutionary War was the spirit of 76, the spirit of spiritual transformation. Look at your history, and you see examples of it throughout your history. Jesus the Christ had how many disciples? 12 plus Jesus. King Arthur had how many knights in the round table? 12 plus King Arthur is every Christmas. Those of you who celebrate Christmas will sing a song about 12 days of Christmas. And the 13th day is January the 6th, which is celebrated by Catholics as the day of the Epiphany, or the day of the spiritual transformation of Jesus the Christ. So 13, there's nothing unlucky about the number 13. It represents a different way of seeing reality. What's the significance of the birth date of this country? The United States, the official birthday of this country is July the 4th, 1776. What's the meaning of that? 7 and 6 is 13. What's the significance of July the 4th? July the 4th fell exactly 13 days after the summer solstice, which fell on the day of June the 21st in the year 1776. So this whole country is rooted in a level of scientific and philosophical and spiritual information that the average person knows nothing about, and the wealth of that information comes from you. Comes from you. So this symbol here is a copy of the symbol of Heru, the resurrected, the son of the resurrected God. And if I were a patent attorney taking the United States to court, suing them for copyright infringement, I doubt seriously if a judge and 12 people in the jury would not rule in my behalf. Again, I also show you here that the stars above the eagle's head form 2 pyramids. These 2 overlapping pyramids represent the masculine and feminine complementary aspects of God. Ain't nothing Jewish about these symbols, sisters and brothers. They represent the masculine and feminine complementary aspects of creation. Next slide, please. Here again, I want to take you back to Hayamaket. Again, I want to play the role of a psychiatrist. I want you to study this image. More specifically, I want you to focus your attention on this stone tablet, this stela in between the paws of Hayamaket. The next slide shows you an enlargement of that. Can we have the next slide, please? Again, I want you to look at this image, and I want you to go back now. And I want you to tell me what thoughts come to your mind when you see this image. 10 Commandments, all right? Good idea. And again, when you all think of the 10 Commandments now, you must be aware of the reality that Moses was born in Egypt. Moses was a very common Egyptian name. It says in the Bible, Moses was learned in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians, which meant that he went to school in Kemet. And Moses, when he led his people out of Egypt, gave them laws, 10 laws, called 10 Commandments. But what they don't tell you is that Moses left 32 behind. These 10 Commandments were a part of the 42 Declarations of Innocence that Moses studied when he was in Kemet. But it's important to note that one of the commandments that he did not give his people was one that said, "Thou shalt not lie." And it's also important to understand the psychological difference between a commandment and a declaration of your innocence. See, because in Kemet, we knew we were godlike. So all we had to do was to attune ourselves to the Creator, and we would become godlike, so that when it came to our day of judgment, we could declare our innocence to God, as opposed to these other folk that had to leave for questionable reasons. They had to be given commandments because of their savage nature. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do that. That attests to their level of savagery. We need to understand the differences. Next slide, please. What about this? The stela. The tombstone. Another African monument which represents a profound psychological need that Europeans have to surround themselves with African artifacts and activities pertaining to life and death. Even in death, they want to take a part of Africa with them because of what it means to them, because of what it meant to you. Your knowledge of death, your knowledge of the continuation of the life cycle was important enough to them to surround their graves with these monuments. And if you were to move around in any cemetery, next slide, you'll see other African structures. What about that? Do you all realize that you are the best kept secret on the planet? Folk have more knowledge about your history and culture than you do. Folk want to be more African than you do. Do you realize what this means? This is their desire to try to be African. And because of our brainwashing, most of our people, unfortunately, they're not in here tonight, but most of them don't want to have nothing to do with Africa, when the world cannot get enough of what African people created. Very important reality. Next slide here. Now, in the process of resurrecting our history and our culture, there are those who are going to set roadblocks in your way, who are going to tell you that to claim Egypt as African is to fabricate history. They ought to know, because they fabricated enough to know the fabrication when they see one or think they see one. And so they even will print in their publications stories mocking history, the Afrocentric myth, and take an image of a Greek philosopher and put a Malcolm X cap on it to make a mockery of your struggle for liberation. They ain't got no respect for you. Next slide shows you even in Newsweek, they gave you this image. Was Cleopatra black? Image of Cleopatra, and put a red, black, and green African earring in her ear. Insulting you at every turn. When in reality, this question is irrelevant. Who cares about Cleopatra? Cleopatra was a product of miscegenation, of the Greek invasion of Kemet. She came hundreds of years after, or literally thousands of years after all of the great monuments had been created. All of the great literature had already been written. Cleopatra is insignificant. If they want her, they can have her. Let's talk about African personalities that are purely African. The next slide shows you an attempt to deal with that issue, all right? The New York Times did a story on our African struggle. And they questioned the legitimacy of Afrocentricity. They contacted a number of scholars. Asa Hilliard was one of them. And Asa talked to them about the Nile Valley origins, the African origins of the Nile Valley, and suggested, rather than bringing up this issue of Cleopatra, he suggested that they show an image of Nefertari, of Queen T. And he said that there are dozens of images around. Why don't you show an image of Queen T? And that will settle the debate. So what did they do? They got this image of Queen T. 3/4 of her face missing. They had that image of Queen T, and this was in the February the 4th, 1990 issue of the New York Times. The title of the article was, "Africa's Claim to Egypt's History Grows More Insistent." The caption accompanying this photograph said, and I quote, "Sculpture believed to be the head of Queen T of Egypt, who lived in the 14th century BC. Revisionist historians argue that she was descendant of black Africans." Given the option now to tell the truth and to come clean, they continue to lie. They showed you this image of Queen T, next slide, instead of showing you this image, which would have answered the question. But they continue to play games. Let's just spotlight one African family. This is Queen T. Let's look at her husband, Amenhotep III. This is the brother, again, even though his nose is missing, you can still tell this is the brother. Let's look at their children. Next slide shows you their oldest son, Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten. And I like to call this brother Lionel Richie, because if you see the statue in Kemet, the brother got a profile similar to Lionel Richie. And what about his younger brother? Next slide shows you his younger brother, his baby brother, King Tut. You all have seen this image dozens of times. I dare say hundreds of times. But how many of you, those of you who haven't gone to Kemet, how many of you have ever seen the back of the mask, back of this statue? Probably very few of you. Why? Because if you see the mask, the back of the mask, it will answer the question as to the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians, not the Greek Egyptians, but the ancient Egyptians. Next slide shows you the back of the mask of King Tut. Braids, cornrows, dreadlocks. Who wears their hair like this? Next slide shows you other images that you will find of African kings, other hairstyles. You never see these images when they talk about the ancient Egyptians. Even though the nose is missing, you still can't get around that hair. Can't get around it. If you go in the Cairo Museum, the next slide you'll see in the Cairo Museum on the second floor, wigs that were worn, next slide please, wigs that were worn by the priests of ancient Kemet. Hairstyle is similar to those worn by sisters today. Ain't no difference, you're the same people. Next slide. This is what they use to comb their hair. Look like that pick y'all used in the 1960s, doesn't it? When you see these images, you realize who we're talking about. We're not talking about an Elizabeth Taylor version of Cleopatra. We're not talking about a Charlton Heston version of African history. Or Yul Brynner, thank you. Next slide. Now, let's deal with a very important reality. Let's ask the question of what happens to a people who have continually been denied their history and their culture, who have been written out of their history and their culture, who accept the lies that they are nothing more than heathens and savages, who believe that they had no concept of God, who believe, as a result of their miseducation, that their dark skin is unattractive, believe that their kinky hair is inappropriate, believe that their good old juicy kissing lips are too big, and this nose that takes in the most important object that you'll ever take in, precious air, that this nose is too wide. And if you buy into the miseducation over periods of time, then you will believe that you are worthless. And if you have enough money, you will eventually pay a plastic surgeon to do to you what Napoleon did to Herr Macket, change your nose and your lips in order to become like your oppressor. But we have to realize that this process did not begin with Michael Jackson. there are numerous entertainers that supposedly have made it, but have lost a portion of their mind in the process of crossing over. Okay? Next few series of slides will share with you this reality. Here we see Patti LaBelle before her change. The next slide. This is Patti after. Now I want you to realize, I want you to understand the pattern that you're seeing. You're seeing images of Africans who, as a result of their miseducation, are now cutting off their noses, cutting off their lips, and frying their hair in an attempt to become more European. All right, let's go forward, brother. Here is George Benson before his change. Next slide shows you George today. Next slide. Stephanie Mills. Stephanie Mills before. Next slide shows you Stephanie after she saw the Wiz, right? Next slide shows you Michael Jackson when he was a normal human being, when he exhibited normal human behavior, when his friends were other human beings and not chimpanzees or drug addict white women. All right. Michael when he was a normal human being. Next slide shows you Michael after reconstructive surgery on his chin 3 times, plastic surgery on his nose 4 times after he's had his cheekbones surgically heightened, his eyes surgically widened, permanent mascara tattooed around his eyes. And y'all can remember back in 1984, 1985, when he got a little bit too close to the hot lights and that electricity caught his jerry curl on fire. So we've got to realize what happens to our people who buy into the lie, who try to become something other than what God created. See, because, we say that we're very spiritual people, and we say that we believe in God, and we say that we believe that we were created in the image of God, but miseducation is a powerful thing. It will make you deny your God by denying yourself. Next slide, please. Now, this issue, this concept was so important that an organization called the Black-Owned Communications Alliance published this ad. And they asked a question. They submitted this question to parents. What's wrong with this picture? What happens to the mind of your children, particularly your male children, who will grow up in a society that will never reinforce their self-worth? What happens to those children who see images of other people as great heroes, but the best that they can see is images of them as drug addicts, as people lying on the ground with body bags being pulled over their bodies, as worthless, ignorant buffoons? What happens to that child? That child will say, I will reject all of those images, and I will accept any image that looks good to me. So if you as parents don't understand your obligation to your children to protect their minds, their fragile minds, from the negative images in the media, then your children will continue to turn on you. As a parent, I felt that it was my responsibility to do what I could to help my daughter, to bring her to the lectures, to introduce her to Doc Ben and Dr. Clark and Asa Hilliard and Lynn Jeffries and Rosalind Jeffries and Frances Welsing and Shashi McIntyre, so that she could see strong African men and women and feel proud about herself. So on one occasion, she kind of threw me for a loop when she came home from school and said, Daddy, they're having a Halloween party at school, and I want to go to the Halloween party as Snow White. I had to stop and think about this. Now, why would she say she wanted to go as Snow White? And I remembered that the movie Snow White had just been re-released. So there were commercials running on television every day. There were advertisements in the newspaper every day. There were images on the back of the cereal boxes. So she is constantly being bombarded with these images, and it's my responsibility to tell my child, baby, if I'm going to allow you to participate in a pagan holiday, pagan celebration, then I'm going to at least let you dress up in a costume that will reinforce some sense of your cultural identity. So I remember going down to the store with my daughter to look for some costumes, and all I saw were images of Batman and Superman and Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, figments of other people's imagination, but nothing that would reinforce within the mind of my child some sense of self. So I said, well, no, I don't see anything here that I'm comfortable with. We will leave. But Daddy, I need a costume for the party. I said, baby, I will make you a costume. And as I'm driving home, I'm kicking myself in the butt. Now I'm thinking, you take these stands, you don't have time to make a costume, but you got to do something. And so I thought of images that I had seen on my travels to Kemet. I thought of appropriate female images for my daughter. So the image of Newt that I had seen in the ceiling of a tomb in the West Bank came to my mind. So I created the costume. Next slide shows you the costume that I made for my daughter. Took a leotard. I painted the sun in the leotard. I painted the stars on her body. She had a little purse with a name tag that said Newt. I drew a description of Newt and a brief definition as to who she was. And I said, baby, when you go to school, for that Halloween party, don't let anybody call you Nut. You are Newt, and you represent an African goddess. All right? Next slide shows you the inspiration for that and why this scene is so powerful, why we need to realize that there are images all around us that we can take, that we can modify to use for our own personal interests. Here's a painting of Newt that shows you this African goddess with her feet and her hands touching the earth and her body stretched across the sky. This is an image of Newt representing the nighttime sky. So here we see her mouth about to swallow the red disk of the sun as it sets in the western horizon. So the sun is now swallowed by Newt, swallowed by the sky, and it then moves through her body. Here you see the little stars in the nighttime sky. The sun moves through her body, and it emerges in the east now as a golden ball of light coming forth from the womb of this African goddess. I said, that is a powerful concept. It's powerful because our ancestors saw the sun as a symbol for God, and they had enough respect for their women to show a woman giving birth to God. Powerful information, powerful images that you all have at your fingertips. So what we've been doing every year since that point in time, while she still celebrated Halloween and they had Halloween parties at school, is that every year she went dressed as an African personality, all right? The next slide shows you an image of her. Let's see. This is when she went as Queen T, all right? Won first prize at the Halloween costume at school, all right? And what's so interesting is that as a result of our exchange, there are other sisters and brothers who are now coming to school, Halloween, dressed as African person. I saw a little brother come in one day as Imhotep, the first architect in history, all right? Queen Nzinga. We've got, stop and think about it. Why, what person in their right mind would allow their child to go out of the house dressed as a witch, dressed as a monster, dressed as Freddy Krueger, and then you wonder why your children are acting like beasts? You reinforce that madness. You have an opportunity every day to give your children something that they can hold on to, something that will allow them to resurrect their African personalities. I took my daughter to Egypt with me on one of my study tours in 1989. I took her because I wanted her to see what I had seen. I didn't want her to wait until she was 28 years old to begin to see the truth. I wanted to understand why Daddy was spending so much time traveling over in Kemet or traveling, lecturing to different people. And so what we did was, when we came back, my daughter was 8 when she made that trip to Kemet. And so what we did when we came back was to sit down and write about her experiences. And the end product was my daughter's book entitled My First Trip to Africa. All right? We made an extended homework assignment of that book. Worked on it every evening. We talked about what she had seen. We talked about why we went to Kemet. We talked about how we got there. We talked about what she did when she got back. And as a result of having written that book, my daughter, who is now 10, she was 8 when she wrote the book. My daughter now lectures. She's lectured with Dr. Clark in Cleveland, Ohio 2 years ago. She travels all over the country talking about her experiences as a young author. And so, my daughter and I have this working relationship. And that working relationship is my commitment to her that wherever you travel with me outside of the country, we're going to write a book about your experiences. And the proceeds from the sale of your book is going into a trust fund to pay for your college tuition. So the deal is this. It's very simple. Allow my daughter to keep 10% of the sales of her book, 10% of the honorariums that she receives, and she uses that money to pay for school-related expenses. She doesn't go out, don't buy no Nintendos in my house. You take that money, you want to take piano lessons? Okay, baby, you can take piano lessons. Your piano lessons cost $10 per half an hour, but you have got to pay for your piano lessons with the money that you earn. So there's no better feeling that comes over her at the end of that half an hour piano lesson when she reaches into her pocket and pays her piano teacher with her money. Okay? So the deal is that we're working on our second book now. We went to West Africa this past summer, Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, and the Ivory Coast. We're working on our second book, which we'll have out by Kwanzaa, the end of the year. And the deal is by the time my daughter is 17, by the time she's ready for college, she'll have at least 6 books to her credit and $100,000 in the bank. Very realistic. I'm teaching my daughter the reality that she does not have to go to school to get a job. I'm teaching her she is a job. That is the reality, and that's how we've got to deal with our youth. Next slide, please. This issue is so vital. Let's have the lights, please. Let me kind of bring things to a close. This issue is important for us because, as I stated earlier, we're fighting for our lives. We're fighting for the lives of our children. We have a responsibility to see to it that they are properly educated. The information is available to you all. The information should be available to our children in the classroom. You're tax-paying citizens of the United States. Your money pays for those schools. So you have a right to insist that the books that are now available outside on the tables that the vendors have are books that need to be in the classroom, need to be taught to your children. We had an interesting experience with my daughter's book. A woman who lived in Bowie, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C., gave a copy of my daughter's book to her 10-year-old son. This brother went to school, did a book report on my daughter's book, turned it in to the teacher. The teacher later reprimanded this 10-year-old brother in front of the entire class and told him that his book report was unacceptable because it was entitled My First Trip to Africa, and the book report was about Egypt, and everybody knows that Egypt is not in Africa. 2 years ago. Fortunately for this young brother, he had a parent who was truly interested in his education. And when the son told the mother what happened, the mother came up to school, and I don't have to tell you, she went off on the principal, she went off on the teacher, she gave them both a history lesson and a geography lesson, had the teacher apologize to her son in the classroom, and insisted that it never happen again. You know, so when I was working on my latest publication, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, I wanted to design a publication that could be used for the classroom, a textbook specifically for those teachers that want to teach about this information but don't have the books. Don't have the books? I use my skills as an artist, I use my knowledge of history and design a book for you. I talked with Dr. Clark last June. We were at a conference in New Jersey last June, and Dr. Clark was asking me about the book, how the sales were going, and he mentioned to me that the book should be used in the textbook, in the classroom, and that he said, you know, you need to do a study guide for that because teachers don't like to do a lot of work. You know, so if you can do a study guide, then you can ensure that the book will be used by more teachers. So, never one to disrespect any advice that I get from Dr. Clark. I said, I'll work on it. During the summer, I had two brothers, two sisters and a brother, friends of mine, school teachers in the Washington area, work on a study guide. The study guide came out in January. Lesson plans, every chapter in the book, information that can be Xeroxed and passed out to the classroom, answers to the questions, all right? So there's no reason for people not to gain access to this information. We also just recently developed a videotape, and we've put together what we refer to as a multimedia educational system, all right? So that we're developing information that can be used specifically for the classroom. Information that can be used in the classroom, information that can be used at home, information that can be used in the study group. So that there's no reason for us not to begin to access that information and then not to begin to use that information to liberate ourselves and our children. Sisters and brothers, we're at a very critical point in our history. So pleased to see that as one president is being buried in the United States, a new president is being resurrected in South Africa. We need to understand that we're about to see the nature of the world change. And the question that we have to ask is, where are we going to be when the world changes? I want to leave you with a poem from my first book, the Browder file. The poem is entitled Transition 13. And now that I have explained to you the symbolic and the spiritual significance of the number 13, hopefully you can interpret this poem as it was meant to be interpreted. Transition 13 states, in the beginning we knew not, and we studied, and we learned all there was to know, and we taught others. Then we forgot what we had learned, and then forgot that we had forgotten. Now we are taught by those who were once taught by us knowledge that we already have. So we study, we learn all there is to know, and we teach others. And the question that we must ask ourselves, sisters and brothers, as we prepare to move into the 21st century is, will we forget again? Thank you.